I'm going to break down borderline personality disorder like you'll never hear anywhere else, because that's what I do. Oh, and I'm going to front load the video with the most useful stuff right after the intro. There should probably be a book, but I'm so riddled with ADHD that I'm going to stick to the important parts and just smush it all together. If you haven't heard me mention my theory of everything before, or thought I was being hyperbolic, well, buckle up, you won't think so by the end of this video. I started out just planning to touch base on borderline because I happened to catch YouTuber Ashton Birdie talking about it in her live stream Friday the 10th. But then coincidentally, I had several people ask me about it over the following week, and I thought maybe I shouldn't keep this information to myself. There's so much intellectual noise on the subject, and I haven't even heard a good response from my boy Jordan Peterson. So we really need to give this subject a completely clean shave. I think I need to add some credibility at the start of this discussion, so here's the bibliography for this video. It's in APA format if you're a stickler for that sort of thing. And although I try to be thin on the personal details, I think it's important that I mention two things. First, for about 3 years I worked with a city mental health crisis response team that in part would evaluate people for psychiatric hospitalization. So I've seen all kinds of crazy, and yes, that's a technical term. Here's how I define it. Second, someone very close to me had borderline personality disorder, so I've had a lot of first-hand experience. She had 9 out of 9 diagnostic criteria at clinical severity for about 10 years from her mid-teens. This includes multiple suicide attempts, psychiatric hospitalizations, 1 residential placement, living for about a month homeless on the streets, a couple of arrests, some epic meltdowns, and a string of 5 to 10 completely ineffective therapists. Somewhere in her mid-20s this changed, and for something like the last 10 years it seems she's had 0 out of 9 clinical criteria. Now, I'm absolutely not going to be selling you a miracle cure. There's no such thing. No magic wands, no quick cure. Got it? Good. But current mental health providers seem a bit neurotic themselves when it comes to treating BPD, so I think I can provide you with a good starting point in this video. Now, I promise to keep this as short as I can, but it's still not going to be very short. And I think I absolutely have to start by saying professional help is valuable and often absolutely necessary if you think you or someone else has BPD. I really suggest talking to a professional who's comfortable working with this disorder. But there's one thing that a professional can't give a BPD client that's something they desperately need. A real relationship with a real human being that cares about them. A reciprocal relationship. These aren't things that you have with a therapist. A therapist and a client may get along very well and may like each other, but that's not the point of the professional relationship. Therapy is a place where you're provided with new skills and new perspectives, and then you take those to your real relationships and practice them. Think of improvement like learning to play the piano, practice and slow, steady progress, lessons, and again, daily practice. Although there are several ways to speed up the process, maybe better techniques you can learn to play, it's still about the practice. So here's the plan. I'm going to try to make this for friends, family, and self-help. I'm going to start with some very practical information for those with short attention spans or a desperate feeling of needing something new right now. I'll really try to avoid getting into anything unnecessary, but too short simply won't be good enough. So then I'll move deeper into the theory in the second part, but I'll break that up with some book recommendations in the middle, because if you really want to understand this, you're going to have to do some reading. And understanding is the best way to personalize it to your situation. Oh, and last thing, I want to state up front that I have a problem with the name borderline personality disorder. Like, I think there are problems with literally each of those 3 parts, both historically and philosophically. But I can't throw all the things at you at once, so we'll just have to put that on hold for now. So let's jump in by tackling one of the most interesting and misunderstood questions in human history, just to give us some firm footing, you know? What are emotions? Sadly, all of psychology seems to have failed at this simple question. For the first half of this book, though, I really thought how emotions are made was going to get us there. I highly recommend the first half. After that, she loses the plot entirely by the second half, goes off on politics and postmodern religion, whatever. Anyway, if I ever get to my third theory of everything lecture, I'll focus on the research behind all of this, but here you go. Emotions are the way your pattern recognition mind brings information to your attention. That's it. It's fuzzy because it needs to be. It's not logical and deductive like the left hemisphere. It's the right hemisphere. It gives you a general sense of what's going on, not an exact sense. Thus, emotions are general and multi-layered. So I've talked about parts of this a lot before, but I think it's the foundational description of human perception of the universe. Your left brain is the logical, attentive process that looks at individual items and applies judgments. Your right brain is the holistic pattern recognition process that looks at groups of items and makes guesses about what they mean together and what parts are most important and what parts represent a group. And sometimes it can represent multiple groups or multiple patterns. It tries to take all of these objects and make them into a complete picture. The brain is intended to use both of these processes simultaneously and cooperatively. That's the key word here because that's where we mess it all up. We have the two sides fight with each other, but we want to make them cooperate. I don't know why this would seem unusual or unique. It's the same thing everyone's been saying for all of human history. I mean, seriously, think about it. This is the yin and yang and Tao from the East. It's the deductive and inductive and abductive logics from Western thought. It's Hegel's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's Jung and Campbell's archetypes of sunlight, moonlight, and twilight. It's even the two sides of the political divide and that cooperative middle we can never seem to reach. 'Cause again, we all like fighting with each other, apparently. If you want more information about how this works neurologically, I'll leave a video in the description about split brain patients that I think everyone should see. Also, I highly suggest the work of Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It follows the same themes, but let's stick with the split brain patients for a second. Researchers found a way to ask questions to each side of the brain without the other side knowing. And sometimes each hemisphere of the same person's brain would have a different opinion on the answer. One person was asked what they would like to be if they could choose anything for a career. His left brain responded with architect, a good, logical, linear answer. His right brain responded with race car driver, an adventurous, emotional answer. You can see how the two can be opposed. I don't think you're going to be drawing up building plans while driving 150 miles an hour, although I suppose you could figure out a way to do both at different times. But each of us has to get these two sides to cooperate. Even though they don't always agree, each has a fundamentally important purpose in our ability to understand the world around us. So, emotions are the way your right brain communicates with your left. How does this work for the organism as a whole? If I perceive myself to be in a good place, successful, and connected with others, then my right brain communicates happy emotions, blends of dopamine and serotonin. Maybe a person I just met seems important in my life, like they can contribute something, and they have things that I'm lacking while at the same time being somewhat similar to me. Well, then I get wonderfully physically relaxing and loving feelings of oxytocin and pain-reducing endorphins. Maybe an event looks like other times I've been threatened or hurt. Well, then the brain prepares the body for action with adrenaline and cortisol and alerts the mind with feelings of fear. The right brain is literally preparing the body and the mind to use the sets of skills that go along with its perception. It prompts the mind for what to pay attention to and prepares the body for what actions to take. The goal should be to make those feelings as accurate as possible and to communicate more than just good or bad, but actually tell you how good or how bad, what kind of good, what kind of bad, and how sure it is that it has the correct pattern. Back to learning to play the piano. When the danger alarm bell is going off, it can be much more difficult to play in front of a crowd at a concert than it was to play by myself at home. The emotions are the result of my pattern recognition mind preparing me for an incompatible set of behaviors. It wants to perform well, but at the same time it recognizes the social dangers and may respond to them as if they were physical dangers. The fear says, clench the muscles, ball up the hands, get ready to punch something. It doesn't say, relax your fingers and let them flow gracefully across the piano keys and everything will be fine. At least, it doesn't say that until you've practiced in front of people for a while. Once you desensitize yourself to these responses, once you train yourself to recognize how to act on the emotion, then you improve your performance. So there you go. That doesn't sound too hard. Borderline people struggle because they're trying to match a pattern to a situation where it doesn't fit. Or maybe it does fit, but not to the extreme that they feel it does. And we've already established this isn't the logical side of the brain that you can reason with. No, patterns take time to be observed and created and understood. Yes, the piano performance does have many social dangers related to bad performance. So some fear is legitimate, but not the level of fear that makes you feel like you're being stalked by a serial killer. That's an incorrect pattern. But if you've had trauma or you've actually been stalked, or maybe you just feed your brain with stories of serial killers or Lifetime movies where people are kidnapped, then obviously you're going to be more likely to see those patterns when they don't exist. Oh, or the nightly news where we pay them to scare us because that's literally how they make their money. I wish people would recognize this. You pay them to frighten you. But never mind, that's a tangent. Here's how society makes this worse. I talk about it often because I see it everywhere. We're still having the Plato versus Aristotle debate over and over, the deductive versus inductive logic. And there's no compromise between the two. For some reason, we think you have to be either the team emotions or team logic. One side or the other. My facts don't care about your feelings, and my feelings don't care about your facts. Yes, that's the team blue and team green themes that I've been mentioning in my last several videos. And my point is, most of this conflict is unnecessary. Let me spell this out. Your thinking mind can be wrong about logic, as anyone who's ever taken a math class can attest. Your pattern recognition mind can be wrong about emotions, as anyone with a little self-reflection can attest. But let me focus on the part that doesn't get said enough. Your emotions can be correct when your logic is wrong, particularly when you don't have enough time or enough information and can't just give it a good think. The problem is we don't give people tools to intentionally choose between the two sides and decide which one is being correct. We don't highlight examples of correct emotions, inductive logic, in the face of left brain deductive logic. We need to teach people how to test feelings and test thoughts and see which side should be trusted in a given situation. Okay, story time! Oh, I hate having to do this, but I actually do need to give a story example. Stories are the most common way that we program our pattern recognition mind. In that way, I won't just be convincing your logic, I'll be convincing your whole mind, and you can start to see the process of correctly recognizing emotional information and comparing it to logical information. So, with minimal details, I had a situation where an expert told me something had gone horribly wrong and it was going to cost like $6,000 to fix. But don't worry, we can get some kinds of insurance and it'll cut you down to about $1,000, blah, blah, blah. Now, I was in my mid-30s, a very self-assured, independent kind of guy, and not conflict-averse at all, highly logical. But while I was being told this, I felt the overwhelming desire to cry. Okay, so I'm not borderline myself, and I had the money. It's not like my children are going to starve or something. There was no real reason that this should be so emotionally impactful. It was so weird, like one of the weirdest things in my adult life. Nothing like that had ever happened before. It was such an unusual swirl of emotions I couldn't make sense of it, but I had well-practiced professional skills to fall back on, so I made an excuse about not having the money and dodged their attempt to make a payment plan, said my niceties, and left. With a bit of effort, I found another expert. He was shocked by their estimate and completed the job for about $150. He said he was really surprised to hear about this estimate, but that he had heard of places that would provide scripts and teach people how to upsell customers in emergency situations. So now we can see why the alarm bells were going off. And with a little thought, I can come up with 4 different feelings I was having. Let me rephrase, 4 different patterns I was recognizing and my responses to them. First, I was obviously recognizing some pattern about being conned or perhaps observing someone operating off of a script rather than talking to me as a person. Maybe I noticed that they were trying to pretend to be sweet and caring or something along those lines. The second feeling, though, was vulnerability, which matched my pattern of lack of knowledge and my entire reliance on what the expert was telling me. The third was anger, which is a response to the first pattern, because if you're being lied to, obviously, that's a good time to stand up for yourself and a good reason to create a conflict. But then there was the fourth pattern, which was doubt again, because I had no logical information to back up my belief, and if I just started a conflict with no reason behind it at all, I wouldn't get very far. All the real information was held by the expert, but yet I wanted to react in an angry way. Yet I recognized I might need this person in the future and didn't want to burn that bridge. So I felt very torn, and the only response my pattern recognition could find to prompt my body to do was cry. I didn't do that, though. I held it together, powered through. Interestingly enough, though, a few years later I had almost the exact same thing happen, but I didn't feel even a tenth of the emotion that I had the first time. This was more like a twinge, a reminder of a previous feeling. But even though I haven't named that emotion, I can now recognize it. It's its own feeling now. I created a new emotion to match a new pattern, to communicate information more effectively. And the emotions will calm themselves down if they know their left logical brain is paying attention to the correct information and can handle the situation. The right brain has to start seeing a pattern of being able to trust the left brain and the decisions that it makes. But here's the real point. The right brain didn't have to get as upset because it didn't feel the need to shout at me like it did the first time. It was in an unusual situation and didn't have a solution. Now it recognizes the situation and knows that I can find a solution. Before that, it wanted to make sure I was taking seriously a possible danger that it could see, and my left brain couldn't. And this is the goal. The two systems, as Kahneman says, need to cooperate to figure out the truth, or at least as close as you can get to it. Sometimes the truth is just unknowable. Now, the hang-up is that the emotions are rarely corrected quickly. Like I said, patterns take time to develop and time to recognize, So it takes time to program them into your brain. And as I mentioned before, part of the pattern the right brain is recognizing is whether it thinks the left brain is going to be able to handle the situation. When it doesn't, then it's recognizing a pattern of not being able to handle things, which is going to make emotions louder and probably going to make you make worse decisions. You see how it's a fun little cycle here that we can get trapped in? The better you learn to find the truth and act on it correctly, the more trust your right brain is going to have in your left brain decision making. And I'm not saying you're going to become an emotionless person or a stoic or something. The point is you won't have overwhelming, overpowering emotions because the right brain won't need to shout at you anymore. Then again, at the moment I'm only talking about short-term patterns and short-term problems. If you have persistent problems, then the patterns get harder to reverse because it takes more time to counterbalance them. Depending on how long you've been watching yourself engage in ineffective patterns, it may take a good amount of time to start recognizing that your choices and patterns are becoming more effective and more consistent. Once you've experienced the pattern of consistently playing a song well, you're not going to be as intimidated to play in front of other people. But when it's still new, you're going to be very uncertain about your skills. And that consistency is what's needed in order to build that trust in yourself between your left and right hemispheres. This is why I started with the piano analogy. It's not just about hitting the right keys. It's also about hitting the right keys at the right time. You can't rush the beat, or the song will sound horrible. And at the risk of repeating myself too much, it's absolutely necessary that the two sides cooperate for a person to function at their best, or sometimes at all. Everyone has some conflict between the two sides. That's normal. In fact, really that's the point. They're supposed to error correct each other. There's supposed to be a tension there where they don't always agree. They both have different perspectives and need to act like checks and balances on a search for the truth. Okay, so honestly, maybe it doesn't seem like much, but in broad strokes, I define both the problem and the solution. Cognitive behavior therapy, for example, will use your attention, logical mind, to find several examples of events that more accurately fit reality. And looking at those events over time, or several examples of those events, create new patterns and then new emotions. Albert Ellis's model said thoughts create feelings, and feelings motivate actions. That's great, although it's not always right. He missed the facts that this lady is starting to recognize before her postmodern swan dive, and that is that our cognition and pattern recognition don't just respond to actual external phenomenological events. It also responds to patterns inside our biology, inside our social environment. Sometimes the body can create emotions, and those emotions direct our logical attention to certain events. I've used this example for years, but what if someone has an adrenaline spike? It may have a 100% physiological cause, but then it gets interpreted by the pattern recognition as the same thing that happens in frightening situations. The fear generated by that pattern is then passed on to the logical mind, and the logical mind desperately starts looking for things that could be a potential danger. It's like Jonathan Haidt talked about with the lawyer riding the back of a rampaging elephant. The left brain gets used to making logical excuses for whatever the emotions in the body do. It tries to make sense out of the world from its perspective. It's going to end up believing that it has more control over the situation than it actually does, and thereby lose the power it does have because it's making decisions based on incorrect information. And now we're going to take this a little bit deeper, like Inception or something, because the way your left brain lawyer describes the actions taken by the right brain and the physiological elephant also becomes part of the pattern that your right brain recognizes. This whole thing becomes a sense of yourself. In fact, your right brain even looks at its own pattern of emotional reactions. So, patterns of emotions that you've had before may end up recreating themselves just because you recognize that pattern in a new situation. It's like the right brain takes the physical situation, the social situation, its own emotional reactions, and your thinking, puts these all together in a pattern, looks at your history of choices in the past, other people's choices, the consequences of all of these things coming together, and balls all this up into one giant guesstimation of where you are, what you're doing, and where you're going. It assembles a puzzle into something that seems consistent, and that thing is your sense of self. What you think of as you is this pattern of all of these events, past, present, and future, all put together, and the trajectory that that creates. So I'm going to let that sit for a second. The pattern of your life, all the thoughts, feelings, events, all your different desires, your hopes, all of this is put together into one pattern that is your sense of self. In reality, you're probably nothing like your 7-year-old self. In fact, if you're an adult, most of the cells in your body have probably died and been recreated since that time. And you've certainly learned more and grown and changed in that time. But yet, if you haven't had any serious trauma or made some seriously life-altering decisions like becoming addicted, or maybe a positive decision to take control of your life in that period of time, that 7-year-old self probably still feels like you, because you are the result of that initial trajectory. And unless the trajectory got thrown way off, then you can see the consistency and the pattern. I'm going to suggest that if you have BPD, maybe you don't relate to that 7-year-old self. What if that pattern that makes us feel like a consistent person got broken into pieces? Now perhaps you're starting to understand the borderline experience. So how can this be practically helpful? Well, for one, I think it lays out the path for understanding what your emotions are and how they're not supposed to be managed like little children running around in your head, like half the population does. And you don't give them free range either to do whatever they want, like the other half of the population does. You sit down with them and negotiate. What are the different feelings in a situation? What do those feelings remind you of? Then use your left brain to find similarities and differences between the patterns. Be a scientist. Come up with different possibilities that the patterns you're seeing could be a part of, or at the very least, 2 possibilities, one good one and one bad one. And then think through, don't feel on this part, think. Think through a test for them to give you a better idea of which pattern you're actually seeing. When you have a feel for the situation, break down the patterns you're seeing, compare them to other patterns you have seen, create a hypothesis, and test it. You know, sometimes people will say, I feel like something is true, and then other people will respond that that's a thought, not a feeling. This may not be accurate. It's really worth identifying the difference between thoughts and feelings, and then being able to recognize them for what they are. When your pattern recognition is giving you a vague idea of what might be happening in a situation, it's entirely appropriate to call that a feeling, whether there's emotion attached or not. Actually, it may be helpful to recognize when that pattern recognition is being presented to your logical mind when there isn't an emotion. It may make you more able to clearly separate out the pattern and the feeling. Now, if you spent time looking at the details and doing the math, then you should call whatever you believe a thought process, because that becomes what you think. Start to learn the difference between the two, to respect the different kinds of information both systems are giving you, and to correct your feelings when they're wrong, or your thoughts when they're not acting in accordance with your values, or your perception of your needs. So there you go, practical information up front. I don't know if that was too deep or not, but it's going to get deeper. From here on out, it gets more philosophic and academic, even though I kind of hate academia. And I'm looking at the time so far, I don't think I'm ever going to get this thing out if I go through my entire script. I'm about halfway through what I had planned. So I'm going to have to do the rest in another video. This will be part 1. But I do want to go through the books because I think it's important that you have a general idea of where to go for more information. Because if you're struggling with this, you're going to need more information. So I'm going to let those ideas cook for a little bit while we take an academic sidestep, which will become important in part 2. Book review.
Plato time! Let's finally review Plato, the Republic.
So, my book reviews and suggestions if you're really interested in learning about BPD. For the record, some of my sources may be a bit dated. I started looking into BPD first around 2011, maybe 2013. I already had my master's, but I went back for an elective in mental health crisis response, and interestingly, at the time, the number was something like 25% of mental health resources, particularly psychiatric hospitalizations for adults, were accessed by the BPD population. So it's obviously a diagnosis you're going to end up seeing in crisis services. I started. This is Sparta! I started with Marsha Linehan's 1993 book on DBT, and I do recommend it. Honestly, I have a lot of disagreements with the book kind of philosophically, but at the same time, its value just can't be understated. It was a godsend to the mental health community and showed definitively that help is possible. Before the 90s, BPD was often considered hopeless for some reason. Although I do believe research showed that it still improved with age even then. Also, I would really like to see how Carl Rogers would have handled working with a BPD person back in the 50s. I think his approach might be more successful than some of the others, if he had just provided a small amount of structure to go along with it. But back to Linehan. I have both great respect for her and her work, but I also believe it has several problems. Good points. First, her dialectic approach to me seems obviously like Hegel and reminds me of Aristotle and McIntyre's approach to virtue ethics, which if you've followed me at all, you know I love. And since I've been calling myself a virtue ethicist since the 90s, yeah, I think it fits. So their ideas added a lot of context to what she was saying, but also raised some questions, and I wanted to integrate all of these various concepts into my thinking. For the record, there's almost no meaningful cross-pollination between philosophy and psychology, and honestly, both disciplines are much the worse for it. But anyway, so looking for answers to some of these things, I read about 15 more books and reviewed maybe 50 to 100 journal articles on the topic. I still have many of those saved on my computer someplace, I think. But nothing really put it together for me until I came across this. Russell Mears' Dissociative Model of Borderline Personality Disorder, which I thought was one of the most brilliant things I'd ever read, and I started reading philosophy in high school. His ideas have applications beyond just BPD, but more importantly, for the first time, someone was able to articulate the actual problems that counseling should have been addressing and the developmental path that it might have taken if it had followed William James or Carl Jung rather than the more popular Freud. It was an interesting reinterpretation of the entire field in my mind. After all that reading, I want to give you my book recommendations, which are also to some degree where I'm pulling my information from. The first two are very academic works on BPD that I've already talked about. The third just has the most creative title ever, doesn't it? Personality Disorders and Eating Disorders. It's not dedicated to BPD, but it does have some really interesting connections. Particularly that most people with eating disorders have some kind of personality disorder. It's harder to measure how many people with BPD have eating disorders, but easier to measure the other way around based on the clinical population of an eating disorder clinic. One study seemed to show that 1/3 of people with bulimia have BPD, although I do have some concerns about research methodology in that if you're finding people who are severe enough to be in an inpatient eating disorder clinic, that may make them different than the rest of the eating disorder population. I find the similarities between the two groups, BPD and bulimia, just so interesting. In fact, I briefly considered going back for a PhD in psychology, and this was my research interest, comorbid BPD and bulimia. But have I mentioned I really can't stand the academic industrial complex? Oh my gosh. For general audiences, though, I really suggest Lost in the Mirror. I think it's really the best book out there to help you understand the internal experiences of someone with BPD with the least judgment possible. Really wonderful book. Now let me do a couple of one-sentence reviews of other books aimed at general audiences. I Hate You, Don't Leave Me is a popular book, although I understand the title might be a bit catchy and it's kind of a meme by itself. It's also got a little bit of a judgmental edge, and I kind of felt that all the way through the text. It didn't seem to find the positive aspects of the borderline behavior. And typically there are positive survival skills that are part of the borderline's approach to the world. Stop Walking on Eggshells, I literally don't remember anything about it, not good or bad. So that's actually a bit of an endorsement because I tend to remember things that I disagree with or think are dumb. That probably means it would be a good book to help someone with boundary issues dealing with borderline friends or family. How to Talk to a Borderline. Absolutely hated everything about it. In my opinion, worse than useless. That brings me back to Russell Mears. He has a smaller clinician's workbook, and he and his team have developed a conversational model of treatment that I think every therapist should read. There are some wonderfully helpful ways to communicate, which can be immediately effective. They're pretty easy to learn and understand, but I think it would be really hard to make into a habit. Both of his books are kind of difficult reading, too. I go into some of the conversational techniques he describes, but they might lose some of their punch if people started recognizing that you're using a studio with his ideas because they're so brilliant and so useful. But I'm going to have to call this a day because it's already taken me like a week and a half to write and edit this thing, and who knows how long the graphics are going to take. But next video, I will start off with the question of how do we negotiate between ourselves? How do we make this communication possible? I'll get into my theory of personality and then present both a personal as well as a therapeutic model that can be used to help this negotiation. Luckily, I already have it written, so I'm going to start recording real soon. Hit that little subscribe button and you'll see it when it comes out.